Hello, and welcome to Odaacity with Ayantu and Siare. Here at Odaacity, we bring you informed and diverse discussions on the most contentious issues that matter most. The Odaacity podcast is a forum for deliberation, fresh ideas, and critical thinking on current affairs. In this episode of Odaacity, we have with us Soreti Kadir as we discuss the evolving role of the diaspora community in conflict resolution. The recent massacre of more than 500 people in Bishoftu at the hands of the military during the annual Ireechaa celebration has sent a rippling effect of anger and frustration not just for Oromos living inside Ethiopia, but throughout many parts of the world in the diaspora. While friends and family members resist the centuries-old oppressive system of the Ethiopian enterprise, how can the diaspora community contribute to a sustainable and justice-driven resolution process? And how does the diaspora community find purpose and belonging from inside the experience of a kind of limbo, while wrestling with the notion of identity and continuity and the preservation of self? These and many more questions will be discussed in this episode of Odaacity. Okay, let's start off with the most recent events in the ongoing resistance situation, which has now spread to the Amhara region of Ethiopia. At the annual Ireechaa celebration, more than 500 people died as a result of an armed instigation by the TPLF military. So let's start with you, Soreti. How are young people responding to these solidarity efforts that you see kind of springing up now with the Amhara protests joining in on the Oromo protest? What do you think the young people's perception and experience of all of this is?
First of all, thank you for having me. It's really exciting to be having this conversation on this platform. I feel like it probably conflicts with the idea young people probably have of what a free Oromia or what justice for Oromos is to look like. And I can maybe speak from sort of my experience and kind of what we're taught about Oromoma growing up and how we're I guess taught to look at Oromia in next to Ethiopia, within Ethiopia, without Ethiopia, and how maybe it's difficult to see the solidarity effort for what it is, or difficult to understand what it means for like a free Oromia, or what does this mean? Like, I don't know what kind of questions it's kind of raising, but I could imagine that they are along the lines of, so does this mean we're gonna move, like Ethiopia is going to move forward as Ethiopia and Oromos are going to be within that? What does this mean for Bilisuma? What does Bilisuma even mean in that context? I think even the maybe the most pressing question it raises is the question of identity within Ethiopia. Does this like solidarity effort negate the Oromos I guess right to, or the Oromos effort to maybe redefine what the Ethiopian identity looks like in the future? I could just imagine it's a case for confusion in a sense, and also because like there's not much sort of like conversation around it, so it's for people to sort of understand it better. And there's also like the clear sort of reality of the Oromos having actually done this alone for a very long time in this movement, and the solidarity effort coming in quite recently, and that picture on its own doesn't paint a positive image of, I guess, what solidarity is or what it means, unless, I guess, again, unless we speak to it, and then unless there's dialogue around it from both ends. But even that, I think, maybe is hard to engage in, because we are sensitive towards sharing, I guess, the identity or the identity conversation beyond Oromo borders, which is totally understandable. We were talking about this earlier, Ayan, too, about that inherited trauma of these things, of questions of identity, and how we're pretty reactionary towards anything um, that suggests Ethiopian in the context of who the Oromo are.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I was just going to add, I've been reflecting a lot on this. Many of our families, as Oromos, have really painful experiences with the Ethiopian state. And it's not just our families, it's like consecutive, generations. And so the stories that we've heard about, they're our families' experiences, growing up, I think, for those of us who left a long time ago or who were born outside of the country, sort of like can harden us against possibilities of imagining Ethiopia as a country that is redeemable, as a place of possible healing, as a place that can change and is changing and is dynamic. We often, I think, when we're far away, it's easy to imagine Ethiopia as a static place, as a place that is violent always. And because we ourselves haven't visited or lived in it for an extended periods of time, we can sometimes lack the lived experience of the place as the sort of layered and complicated and dynamic place that it is. And I think this can really limit our imagination of what that country is like. And when I was in Ethiopia and I talked to Oromos, or even just heard Oromos talk about Oromo identity and Oromo culture and their wishes for the future, one of the things that became apparent to me very quickly was how we talk about it differently. The way the diaspora talks about Oromia is really different from the way, Oromos who are in Oromia, who are in Ethiopia, talk about it. Only in the sense that I think while the pain of exclusion is shared, while the pain of historical oppression is shared, I think by virtue of living there, Oromos who are living in Ethiopia have just a much more complex articulation of that lived experience and of their Oromoness. They don't necessarily see the kind of push and pull that people in the diaspora experience between being an Oromo versus being an Ethiopian. So again, it's just like proof of the fact that identity is fluid and it's contextual and lived experience matters.
Yeah, and I think there is, that's really powerful, because I think there's an assumption in the diaspora that we live that reality in the exact same way, and that the pull and the black and white of the Oromo identity versus the Ethiopian identity is a shared and sort of just consensus amongst all Oromos. And I think this is the idea that's not, no, maybe it's not pushed the Oromo, like, teachings of Oromo nationalism, but it's definitely the picture that's painted, the Ethiopian identity, or acknowledging even Ethiopian identity as part of anything of who you are is really demonized, if that's not too strong of a word, in the diaspora. And yeah, I think there maybe is an assumption that that's the way it is in the country as well, which is powerful to hear, that there is a fluidity that we can learn from within the country, that we sort of lack within the diaspora. And if we didn't lack, maybe our ability to support rebuilding and reconciliation efforts would be at a much higher capacity.
Speaking of this identity issue, I kind of want to explore this idea of third culture kids, and I could just even extrapolate that to third culture individuals. Let's just say they're not always children. We grow up to become adults. So third culture individuals, these are people who, like us, have affiliation through birth or through our family to a specific location, a country, and then we have an affiliation with the country that we now exist in. And then we have a third affiliation or identity, which is a combination of those two, and we have to straddle both of these different worlds. So, and within those different worlds, there's all of these nuances that we have to grapple with and kind of form a synthesis of all of these identities. And when we view the conflict that's going on, for example, for us, when we view this conflict as third culture individuals, that sense of certainty is kind of missing. Like what you're just saying, the people that are living this experience back home, they're not really that having such a intense psychological discourse within themselves, for example, of what's happening on the ground. They're just kind of living the experience and seeing the nuances on the ground, whereas we have to kind of contend with this notion of our identity, like who are we representing? When I talk about this conflict to my American friends, who am I representing and what voice am I holding in that moment? And am I really articulating the concerns of the people that are actually on the ground back home? So these are these issues that we have to contend with as diaspora, and I'm not in any way equating this with the struggles that people have to go through back home, but in the spirit of creating a space for pluralism of our identities, I think we need to have these discussions, no matter how trite it might sound to be sitting here and talking about our identity in diaspora. I think it is important to have this because it'll allow us to have a less myopic and less constrained view of the possible solutions, even possible ways that we can get through and resolve these conflicts. What do you guys think about that?
I think it's Paulo Freire in the Pedagogy of the Oppressed that says, without a sense of identity, there can be really no struggle. You can't really struggle if you can't define who you are and what you're struggling for. And I think that as people who are living outside of Ethiopia, and I'm actually really starting to find the term diaspora problematic because I think it lumps together a huge number of people who have very complex and at times contradictory and very different relationship with Ethiopia. Mm-hmm. Not all Oromos in the diaspora have the same relationship with the Ethiopian state, their view of it or how they think about themselves and so on. Part of the Oromo diaspora, the Ethiopian diaspora, is also people who've been recently exiled, people who have left everything they have behind and for whom this is fresh, this is traumatic, and people who can't wait to get back home. That's all they want. And then there's people who've left 30 years ago who've really no intention of getting back and for whom Oromoness is merely a cultural identity. Of course, they care about what's happening back, at home. But who are not as invested in terms of like what should happen. But then there's this active, ongoing, very strong Oromo nationalist framework in our community that really tends to dominate, and that sort of like makes invisible the fact that there are many voices in the diaspora, that there are many different experiences, and there are many different expectations. And I think it's important for us as a diaspora community to sort through that. Each individual has to ask themselves, what is my relationship to this land? What is my relationship to this politics? When I'm on Facebook and I'm writing and I'm sharing things, especially those who have platforms, like what message are you sending? What impact does it have? So I don't think that we should feel guilty about examining all of that, because I think that's important so that we're engaging in a way that's intentional and that's useful and productive and meaningful for ourselves and for Oromos at large and for Ethiopians.
Yeah, guys are just brilliant. Siade, what you were saying about that experience of like that experience of guilt, sort of, and being able to sit and process and just think through things because of the distance sort of we're afforded. I really feel that, and like I've it's something that resonates. And also I'm speaking about there's this sense of like with any, I feel like with any emotional relationship or with anything that we're emotionally attached to as human beings comes a sense of responsibility. And when you're not able to fulfill that responsibility to the level that you think you should, or to the standard that you hold yourself to, or to the level at which you're invested in that attachment or in that relationship, that's like a breeding ground for a whole lot of issues, and issues like that, again, not to equate them to what people have to go through back home, but issues that I think just as equally affect the entire Oromo communities, collectives, in collaboration, diaspora and home, to write a story of progress. If our youngest and brightest minds are plagued with senses of helplessness that will eventually form and become severe health issues, this is a problem if there are not spaces in which young people can kind of talk through these things and begin to, like Ayanto was saying, actually understand what their relationship to this land is. Is it political? Is it what they've been taught most of their lives, a relationship of real proud nationalism? Or are certain people looking to connect on different levels? Are they looking for spiritual knowledge? Are they looking for cultural information? Is this information accessible? I think also what comes with trauma is a closed offness from sharing, even amongst our families. Like if you try and get, like, I don't know, every family is different, but from my experience, even trying to get stories of what happened during the Derg and what happened, during Haile Selassie's time, these things it's hard to just get those those personal accounts from even closest family members. So are those avenues in actually collecting the information that we need to reassess and affirm our relationship to Ethiopia as a country, to Oromuma as an identity? Are they available? And if they're not, what's that going to mean for people trying to forge those connections? And what is it going to mean if they can't? And what's the potential if they could? Like, if that opportunity to explore, we as a community, we took the responsibility. And this, I think, is a responsibility that's really part of the struggle in cultivating future leaders, that responsibility in ensuring that people can go on that journey and that we do facilitate that in a meaningful way. That's the end of my...
I love all those points you just made. It is an opportunity, and it's hard to see that right now because we're kind of in the middle of this process. And I'm interested in the idea of continuity. There's the stories that our parents have told us, right? And we center our identities a lot of times based on those traumatic stories of oppression and fleeing the oppression and what it felt like to live under that kind of tyranny. And we, to honor the sacrifices of those of our parents and those even before them, to allow us and to afford us the opportunity to have these lives and be able to have discussions such as this. We need to have that continuity, though. That when I think of the longer view, then it makes sense, and I see the importance of having these kinds of dialogues. Because what about the future generations, as you just mentioned, Soreti, the future leaders that maybe are going to come from the diaspora? How will they form their sense of Oromuma when they haven't had even first-hand or second-hand accounts from their parents of what it means beyond the political nationalistic discourse. That's really where it's stayed for the most part. I mean, there's people practicing wakafanna, and that's beautiful. And I think young people have an ability to kind of now in today's time read about it and go to Ireechaa in different parts of the world. But on a deeper personal level, on that soul level, are these young people connecting to the Oromuma? Do they understand it, and are they able to synthesize their experiences living as third culture individuals and still hold on to that Oromuma, and then be able to pass it on to their children? Like, we're talking generations, and when I think of the longer view and the generational view, then I do really see the importance of having this, so that the younger people can say, oh, you know what? It's not just me that's confused. There's people, this is okay. This is normal. I don't have to shut off from having to process these burdens, and it is normal. And then what can I do with it, rather than holding it in and feeling isolated.
Yeah, I think also what you said, sorry, Ayanto, I just really rung when Ayanto was talking about not lumping the diaspora to be this just this one experience, and maybe that's the link in connecting those that were born into the diaspora, those that have just come and who have been exiled, who are on the edge of their seats, to share these stories and to share this wisdom. And to build even relationships within that are reciprocal, based on the needs of each, the young people that need to come into contact with these stories and this experience, and those that do need to share what they've been through, and that sharing being able to benefit a cycle of development. It's just interesting, and even that the multi,
Well, I mean, I think both of you have come back to this idea of trauma, and I see a lot of trauma in our community. Even the aversion that a lot of young people have to the very idea of Ethiopia, and even when people say, I'm not Ethiopian, I'm Oromo, but they've never lived in Ethiopia, and don't really know that Ethiopia, what they're responding to, it seems to me, is the trauma of having generations of their family members and people in the community be excluded. And of course, there's the dominant representation of Ethiopia as a, culturally Abyssinian, and the exclusion and the pain of not seeing yourself in the depictions of Ethiopia. So I totally understand when young Oromos who've never been in Ethiopia say, I'm not Ethiopian, I'm Oromo. Because what's Ethiopian to them? They really haven't had opportunity to know Ethiopia beyond the sort of exclusionary dominant narrative of Ethiopianness, and then the trauma of their families on the other hand. And I think a lot of Ethiopians get to go home and they get to know Ethiopia, and they get to relate to Ethiopia, I think, in a way that's not really talked about in Oromo communities in the diaspora. I don't really hear people talking about how they went back to Ethiopia and what they learned and how that helped them with overcoming or with dealing with the trauma of being, I guess, away from the homeland that's sort of imprinted into your psyche, and you identify with. So I think there's definitely a need for diaspora kids to work through the trauma of coming from a community that has been really marginalized.
Yeah.
On the topic of I guess trauma, and I just wonder what would the bringing together of these two different experiences do for the healing process of that trauma? What I mean is that if a third culture kid that has developed, and rightfully so, a very intense aversion to anything Ethiopian meets a person who grew up in the country and does call themselves Ethiopian, has a very strong sense of Oromuma, and can justify their I guess calling themselves an Ethiopian or identifying with Ethiopian on the basis of seeing themselves in seeing themselves as within the bigger picture of Ethiopia, and seeing, I guess, what I really like what Awal called it in your last podcast on Odaacity, the Ethiopian project, seeing this as a continuous process of creation and not necessarily something that's finished and something that is really quite embryonic still. That, because for myself, I remember going to Ethiopia, it only really enhanced my aversion to the country, because going through the capital city and just trying to navigate going from one place to another, I would very innocently just go around to people asking, do you speak Oromo? Do you speak Oromo? Do you speak Oromo? And just be met with ugliness at the fact that I was asking this and not being able to speak Amharic. And that's the same situation in every occasion that I've gone back over my life. And so this only really affirms this aversion. But then in meeting people from the country that have come into the diaspora like recently, or like have spent all of their lives in the country and have such thorough understandings of themselves within the context of Oromoma and Ethiopia, and kind of, yeah, they carry it in a very, almost like just in like in a really poised, elegant way. Like they know where one begins and one ends, where the culture and the sense of self is rooted in the Oromoma, but the vision of the progress and the moving forward can't be detached from this project of Ethiopia. And so each must be acknowledged with weight. I don't know, this was a turning point. It was a shift for myself, and I wonder what similar sort of experiences could do for the healing of a long time of trauma.
Yeah, I think in the diaspora we have a very limited idea of what a proud Oromo looks like. What Oromo looks like in Addis Ababa, some of the people who embody this most amazing sense of Oromo-ness were people who grew up in Addis, in Finfinne, didn't speak Afan Oromo because they didn't have access to it growing up in their home, but like were these avid Oromo music listeners. They were avid observers of Oromo politics and what's happening in the country, and people who really cared a lot. Now, if a diaspora kid was to come, if an Oromo diaspora kid was to come face to face with an Oromo who only speaks Amharic and who is like this avid Oromo, I guess like who's into Oromo things, like I think this would be like a really pleasant surprise, because for me it definitely was. And spending 10 months in Ethiopia really forced me to reevaluate my idea of what I thought, what an Oromo means, what Oromo-ness means, and how people perform that or embody that sense of Oromuma that we talk about. So I think I think the more young Oromos have access to a wide range of perspectives and ideas about and meet actual Oromos who hold these views, I think the better it helps our imagination. Let's keep in mind that Oromos are really large, and there's so many cultures and so many beautiful and rich things. So I think like when we come into it with a more open-ended approach to what's an Oromo, what's Oromoma, what does Oromo-ness look like? Because like Ethiopian-ness, Oromo-ness is a project, or is a thing that's developing, that's being. And every day, more and more people are discovering more ways to practice their Oromo-ness. And it might not look like the idea of Oromo that we have in mind.
Yeah, that's really powerful. I just wanted to add to that, like, I really want to, whenever I have this conversation with people, I really want to say, like, you don't have to accept anything that you feel like is an injustice to the narrative that you sort of believe for whatever reason it kind of has to look like Ethiopia's image is by no way representative of any sort of Oromoness at the moment. Needs to incorporate to fully be Ethiopian. You can't actually call Ethiopia and Ethiopia on the self level, to the national level, to the any level, if you're gonna forget about the contributions of its largest population. And
I like what you just said. Both of you are saying, and what I'm kind of intrigued by is this sense of unification that seems to be spreading throughout the diaspora, the world. You know, even though we have such different experiences of what that means, we can all kind of agree and come together and make a stand against an injustice and oppression. And the challenge then will become, how do we channel all the different voices and interpretations of that identity into creating our new reality moving forward? There are people that want to have independence and the separation. There are people that are willing to work within the federalist framework there. There's so many, and there's people that want to go back to a form of a blend between the old Gada system and what we have today, and try to bring back some of those traditions that we had before into the modern age, which Ayantu and I spoke of in the first podcast. The issue is we've become unified, right, against a common threat, the oppression from the TPLF. Our challenge now, and what we're trying to do in these Odaacity podcasts, is to expand the discourse, to create more space, to have inputs from different experiences. And I think that is the challenge for us, to maintain our patience with each other, to allow different voices to have their different perspectives. As far as the diaspora, we rarely hear of the young people. As they're developing their identities, they might have contributions that are overlooked because they don't feel Oromo enough. And there's that notion to contend with, like, what is Oromo enough, you know?
Oh yeah. Even not speaking the language can push someone to feel like they exist on the periphery of Oromoness, within the diaspora at least. And it's interesting, Sayade, what you're saying about what is it that sort of transcended all of these things and brought us together at this time. It is really in the face of this enemy. But also, like, I feel like I feel, in my mind at least, I've sort of, I see what has happened as the Oromo really seeing themselves as indigenous caretakers of this land, and seeing that the brutalization of their environment and of their livelihood is something that they can't stand anymore, and have to sort of that idea of, like, there's nothing else we have left, sort of thing. And that in itself links back to what you guys were talking about in your first podcast, in terms of the indigenous systems of governance and Gada systems of governance. I feel like that wisdom has really been what has inspired this unification, and that we have a responsibility that is inherent to our Oromoma despite our differences, and that is to not allow further abuse of human beings and further abuse of the lands as well. So I feel like that, I don't know what the future is going to look like, but I do hope and pray that whatever way in which we decide to lead ourselves and govern ourselves going forward does embody and does reflect and utilize that wisdom, because it's I believe one of our biggest strengths as a nation, as a collective. And in that, what you're saying about young people and their voices in this conversation of what does the future look like, I think you're really right when you say that there's just not enough, we're just not informed enough on what each thing would mean. So what would it mean for a separatist Oromia to form? What would it mean to still function within federalist system? What would it mean to incorporate these systems of indigenous governance? Like, what would this actually mean for the future? And I think like there definitely needs to be space for people to be able to shift as they discover more on each of these potentials and potential avenues to shift between, and even like even amongst that, who knows, something completely anew can be created that is a formation of all three plus some other thing we may never have heard of until someone comes up with it. Like, who knows the limits of the imagination.
Right.
One last thing that I wanted to just say is that I think despite the multiplicity in the ways that different Oromo individuals and groups might express and embody their Oromoness, I think there's no doubt unifying, very strong unifying foundations, and part of that is, the issue of land, the issue of identity, the issue of being excluded, not seeing yourself as an Oromo within the Ethiopian imagination. So what I wanted to say is that I think when we're more open, I think our communities are, whether within the Oromo or the larger Ethiopian identity and community, I think our communities are stronger when we're open to people being free to express themselves, to sharing their viewpoints, to talking about things and expressing ideas from their lived experiences. And I think the problem that a lot of people hate Ethiopia under EPRDF is because EPRDF says, my viewpoint is the right viewpoint. It's the only viewpoint. It's the dominant viewpoint. And I think that that's not the way to go when you're trying to create a new society. So, thank you so much for joining us for this episode of Odaacity. We've been talking, Siari and I have been talking with Soreti Kadir. She's a writer, a poet, an amazing artist. And we will link to her Twitter account on our show notes, so you can track her down and continue this conversation, if you hope, through her Twitter, our Twitter, and we're gonna have Soreti on again because she's one of those people who has a really expanded sense of the complex issues at hand, and whose articulation that we really value. Let us know what you think, especially if you're someone who's young, you're in the diaspora, you haven't really lived in Ethiopia or visited. What's your experience like in the diaspora? How do you articulate and how do you embody Oromoness? What factors affect this sense of embodiment? Thank you so much, and that's it for this episode. If you have ideas for the show and or suggestions for guests you'd like to hear, please let us know. You can email us at theodacity@gmail.com. We're also on Facebook and Twitter at the Odaacity Podcast. Odaacity is brought to you by Dagali Media and the Underground Media Collective.